Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a source that really asks us to turn the gaze inward. Excerpts from Jiddu Krishnamurti's What Are You Doing With Your Life?
That's right. And this material, well, it isn't offering a step-by-step guide or, simple answers.
No, not at all.
It's more about challenging us with some pretty fundamental questions about our lives, our minds, how we relate to everything around us.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack some of Krishnamurti's most compelling ideas. We're looking at his perspective on what he calls the self, the nature of the mind, how things like fear and desire operate, and, well, the very fabric of our relationships in society.
Right. And the sources describe him as this figure who really stood outside any established system. He offered no dogma.
Yeah, no prescribed path.
Exactly. And insisted that ultimate responsibility lies with each individual. I mean, he influenced millions, seen by some as a truly revolutionary thinker.
And his approach, as is presented here, wasn't about gathering followers or demanding belief, was it?
No, not at all. He seemed to invite people to join him, not follow him, in just observing the extraordinary phenomena of human existence together, on equal ground.
So for you, our listener, who's maybe grappling with these complex ideas but wants to get to the heart of it without getting tangled in jargon, we're going to try and extract the most important nuggets from this material and hopefully connect them to your own experience.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Well, let's jump right into something the source introduces early on. This really powerful idea that the world isn't something separate from us.
Yes.
The world is us.
It's quite a challenging starting point, isn't it?
It really is.
The source suggests that society, the world we actually experience, is the sum total of our individual inner states and our immediate relationships.
Okay, break that down a bit.
Well, think about it. Our personal prejudices, maybe our feelings of loneliness, our ambitions, our anger, our sadness.
All the internal stuff?
Right. Multiply that by everyone, and that collective.
Yeah.
Well, that forms the problems and the state of the world, according to this view.
So the idea is that if each person is like a piece of the puzzle, changing ourselves isn't just a personal journey, it has a wider impact.
Precisely. The material argues that individual change isn't isolated. If you change, it suggests you affect the whole because, well, it says goodness is contagious.
Interesting phrase.
Yeah, like a ripple effect, starting from the most immediate relationship, the one you have with your own mind.
Okay, that makes sense. And this brings us right to that relationship with the mind. The sources put enormous emphasis on understanding our own minds. Why is that presented as so fundamentally critical?
Because, as the source points out, the mind is literally the only tool we have.
Right.
To perceive, to think, to act in the world. So if that instrument is flawed, or if we don't understand it as it is, then any problem we try to solve with it.
Any relationship
we navigate, any decision we make, it all becomes more complicated, potentially more destructive.
And the source goes so far as to say, understanding your own mind is the first essential function of all education. That's a huge claim, isn't it? Much broader than just learning facts or skills.
It is. It really suggests that true education starts with self-awareness, with turning that observational lens inward.
And the source encourages us not just to accept someone else's description, but to observe your own mind.
Right, look for yourself.
So when you observe your mind, what does the source suggest you'll find? What is the mind in this context?
Well, you'll find it's a product of time, essentially. That's how it's framed.
Time.
Yeah, the source describes the mind as the accumulated result of centuries of conditioning, tradition, culture, family, education, society's values, religious beliefs, all the ideas and knowledge we've absorbed.
Wow, okay.
And thought itself, according to the source, springs from this deep reservoir of memory and background.
And it mentions the mind having different layers too, like conscious and unconscious.
Yes, it touches on that common idea, superficial and hidden layers. But it says this total process, this entire accumulation and activity, that is consciousness.
Okay.
And that consciousness is described as time, built up by everything humanity has strived for and experienced over millennia.
Here's where it gets really challenging, I think. But it also highlights a core conflict. The source describes a fundamental struggle we seem to face.
Right. Life itself is presented as being in constant motion. It's dynamic, never staying still.
Okay.
But our minds, built on memory and conditioning, are often, well, static, fixed, tethered, the source says, to past experiences, beliefs, knowledge.
So when this static, conditioned mind meets the dynamic flow of life.
That's where the source says it creates a constant struggle.
So even learning new things, like, say, science or philosophy, doesn't necessarily solve this struggle.
Not according to this source, no. It argues that simply adding more knowledge to a conditioned mind doesn't free it from its conditioning.
Right, the structure remains.
Exactly. The real problem isn't just encountering life's challenges, but how the mind, burdened by its past, can actually liberate itself. A mind that isn't free, the source claims, only creates more problems.
And understanding the struggle is vital. If we would put an end to misery, sorrow, that's a heavy statement.
It is. It frames it as absolutely essential.
This understanding of the mind leads us straight to the concept of the self, which the source identifies as pretty central to our problems. What does it mean by the self?
Yeah, it's not just, your personality traits or what you like.
Right.
The source defines the self as this whole bundle. The idea, the memory, the conclusion, the experience, all your intentions, conscious efforts to be or not be something.
Okay.
And the entire accumulated memory, personal, family, group, even racial influences. It's the constant striving that comes from this bundle, the desire to be more, the competition.
And the source uses incredibly strong language to describe it, doesn't it?
It does. It intentionally calls the self an evil thing. Yeah. Now, that's provocative language, obviously meant to shock us, make us look closely.
But why evil?
Because the source states that the self is dividing. The self is self-enclosing. Its activities, however noble, are separative and isolating. It builds walls.
But wait, however noble. Even if you're doing good things, if it's rooted in the self, it's still seen as divisive.
That's the subtle, really challenging point. Actions driven by the desire to be someone, to gain recognition, even for good work, are still seen as reinforcing the separative self. The source contrasts this with moments when the self is not there. Moments in which there is no sense of endeavor, which it says happens naturally, well, when there's love.
Okay, so if this self is the problem, how do we even begin to understand it? Where do we start?
The source insists that self-knowledge is a process. It's not a destination, not something you just learn from a book or an expert.
Right.
And this is crucial. So self-knowledge can come only through relationship, not through isolation.
Through relationship, you mean like with other people?
Exactly. It's awareness in action. You don't gain self-knowledge by withdrawing or analyzing yourself in a vacuum. You see yourself with your reactions, your fears, your desires reflected in your interactions.
In how you react to people, to things, to your job.
Possessions, everything. The source argues that to truly transform yourself, and therefore the world, you absolutely must understand what you are in relationship. Without knowing that, any attempt at change is, well, built on shaky ground.
The source also points out how our typical education often leaves us unprepared for the actual, pain and difficulty of living.
Yeah, that's a key point. We learn how to earn a living, how to function in society.
Sure.
But the source suggests we're rarely taught the art of living itself. Life throws tough stuff at everyone: loneliness, confusion, failure, conflict.
It does.
But the source offers a pretty radical insight here. It's not the event itself that causes pain, but our own reactions to what happens to us that is the cause of pain.
Our reaction, like fear, for instance.
Fear is definitely a primary one mentioned. It's seen as rooted in self-protection. Not just physical survival, but psychological self-protection.
Guarding our image, our comfort zone.
Our beliefs, exactly. And the source suggests that trying to escape this pain is a common trap.
How so? What kind of trap?
Well, we try to numb or avoid the pain of loneliness or confusion with distractions, maybe entertainment, keeping busy, even substances.
Sure, makes sense.
But the source says this just leaves the original problem untouched, often adding new layers like exhaustion or dependence.
So what's the alternative then, if escape doesn't work?
Instead of escaping, the source suggests attention to the ways of the self.
A tip, okay.
This means observing your fear, your desire, your anger, recognizing they are natural responses, but seeing that you don't have to be controlled by them or just blindly act them out.
You're just watching them.
This kind of direct, aware observation, according to the source, is what actually dissolves mental anguish. Not fighting it, but seeing it clearly.
Let's dig a bit deeper into thought itself. I mean, we use it constantly. What is thought from this perspective, and what's its function?
Well, the source defines thought quite simply as the response of stored up memory.
Stored up memory.
And that memory isn't just what you did yesterday. It's the deep psychological and neurological history, influenced by everything we mentioned: culture, family, tradition.
Right, the conditioning.
Exactly. Without this memory, there's no thought. And the source does acknowledge thought has a necessary practical function. You couldn't drive a car or use your phone without it.
But it also seems to be presented as a major source of problems, right?
Yes, this is another really central, challenging idea. The source argues that thought, having created the complexity and, well, the mess of society and our inner lives,
Our conflicts, our ideal.
our divisions, it cannot possibly resolve it. Thought is seen as inherently seeking security, and in doing so, it breeds conflict.
So a radical change in human consciousness would involve thought functioning differently.
Exactly. The source suggests thought must operate for practical, physical, technological aspects of life. That's its place.
Okay.
But it must not overflow into another field where thought has no reality at all, which seems to imply the psychological realm, the realm of the self, relationship, understanding truth.
This leads to this source suggesting we look at what is without thought. That sounds almost impossible for most of us. What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, it doesn't mean trying to empty your mind or go blank. That's not it.
Okay.
The source explains it as observing a fact. Maybe you observe you are feeling angry or envious or violent in a moment, and just looking at that fact without the immediate interference of the me.
Without judging it.
Without judging it, labeling it, or immediately struggling to change it according to some ideal of how you should be.
But why avoid the effort to change it? Isn't that what we're supposed to do?
Well, the source makes a subtle but really powerful point. The effort to change something is often just another activity of the very thing you're trying to change.
What's up?
For example, the effort to get rid of anger might be just another form of self-centered activity or resistance, which doesn't actually dissolve the anger. Using an ideal like, I shouldn't be angry, to eliminate what is the actual anger you feel just creates contradiction, hypocrisy within you.
So the challenge isn't eliminating the fact, but looking at it without this internal friction.
Yes, altering the fact without friction, as the source puts it, which requires intense sensitivity and attention to what is without all that usual mental noise of like, dislike, judge, compare, want to change, want to keep.
This brings up a distinction the source makes between intellect and intelligence. We often use those words almost interchangeably.
Right, but the source differentiates them quite clearly. Training the intellect is seen as honing the ability of thought to function independently, logically, analytically, perhaps.
Okay.
But this training alone doesn't necessarily result in intelligence.
What then is intelligence in this context?
Intelligence, according to the source, comes into being when there's perfect harmony, both intellectually and emotionally.
Harmony between thought and feeling.
Exactly. It's where reason and feeling are integrated, where you can feel intensely and reason intensely and do so harmoniously. It's presented as a different quality of mind altogether.
And understanding, real insight, seems to arise from this intelligence, not just from thinking really hard about something.
That's the argument, yes.
Yeah.
The source suggests that deep understanding or insight happens when the mind is very quiet, even for a second, when that constant verbalization of thought is not happening.
A moment of silence inside.
It's described as an extraordinary rapidity of insight that can occur when the mind isn't burdened by its own internal noise of endless thought and analysis.
But how do you get a quiet mind? Is it something you practice or cultivate, like a muscle?
This is another point where the source really challenges conventional ideas. It says such stillness can't be cultivated through effort or technique.
Why not?
Because that kind of forced stillness is like a dead mind. True stillness comes naturally, it argues, when you are intensely aware at the moment of the functioning of your thought and emotion.
So it's the awareness of the mind's activity itself that brings the stillness, not trying to stop it.
Yes. And the source specifically says analysis cripples intelligence. Instead of analyzing why you think or feel something.
Which we do all the time.
Right. The suggestion is simply be conscious of the thinking and feeling happening right now.
A huge thread running through all of this, it seems, is the idea of freeing the mind from its conditioning.
Absolutely central, yeah. The source emphasizes how deeply we are molded by external forces. Opinions, traditions, cultural norms, conformity, and imitation are incredibly powerful influences.
And it says we're crippled by systems, methods, by your teachers. That sounds harsh.
It does, but it seems to mean not just formal education, but all the influences that tell us how we must and must not be, shaping us from the outside in.
And freedom isn't just breaking the rules or doing whatever you want.
No, it's explicitly not about licentiousness. It's about becoming aware of the mind itself, the internal authority that enforces these rules and limitations within you. Freedom from conditioning, according to the source, comes from seeing the totality of that conditioning process, seeing it clearly, without thought, without immediately reacting, without judging it right or wrong. This profound awareness is what the source calls freedom from the self.
How does this connect so strongly to fear? The source spends a lot of time talking about fear.
Well, the source links fear directly to the activity of the self, and very specifically to dependence.
Dependence?
Yeah. When we depend on things or people or ideas for our happiness, our security, our sense of identity, that breeds fear.
Fear of losing it.
Exactly. And this dependence is often rooted in ignorance, from the lack of self-knowledge, from inward poverty, a kind of feeling of emptiness or insufficiency inside.
So psychological fear is the main issue here, different from, say, being afraid of a lion.
Yes, it makes that clear distinction. Psychological fear is our central problem, and it always exists in relation to something. The fear of losing, the fear of becoming, the fear of not becoming.
Right.
And it's thought about the future or the past that brings this kind of fear into being. The source is very direct, stating flatly, the self is the root of all fear.
Wow. And is there an idea presented about how fear can actually end? Not just managed, but ended?
Yes. The source suggests that total and complete attention can bring an end to fear.
Total attention.
When you attend completely to whatever's happening, maybe the feeling of fear itself arises. The source claims that in that moment, there is no observer and therefore no thinker. There is no center from which you're observing.
The observer. That's the me, the self.
That observer is identified as the center of thought, the me, the self, the ego, the entity that stands apart and judges or reacts or remembers. When that observer is fully absorbed in complete attention, when thought about past or future isn't interfering,
Then what?
the source suggests the observer dissolves, and with it, fear ends. Because fear needs that self, that me, to exist in relation to something.
That sounds incredibly challenging to achieve, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's presented not as a passive, spaced-out state, but one requiring a great deal of inquiry, never accepting anything. It's active, intense awareness, not just blankness.
Okay. Moving from fear, the source also explores anger. Where does that fit into this picture?
Anger is seen as another facet of this dependent, self-centered state. The source links it to depending on others for your happiness. It says anger arises when that dependence is disrupted, when you are thrown back upon myself, being fearful of my own state.
So it's connected to fear again.
Very much so. And anger takes many forms: disappointment, resentment, bitterness, jealousy.
And the source connects anger specifically to being hurt.
Precisely. We often get angry because someone says or does something that hurts us. But the source asks, why are we hurt in the first place? What is it that gets hurt?
Right.
It points to self-importance, which stems from having an image of ourselves, an ideal of who we think we are or maybe who we should be.
We create this image. Why? Because we don't know ourselves.
Yeah. The source suggests exactly that, because we have never studied what one is, actually. We don't know the fact of ourselves, so we construct an image, an ideal.
Okay.
Anger is then triggered when this ideal image is attacked or threatened, because the image is actually an escape from the fact of what we are.
So the suggestion is, if you observe the actual fact of what you are without defending the image, then no one can hurt you.
That's the radical claim, yes.
Yeah.
It argues we often live in this ideational world, a world of myth, the world of our self-created images, rather than in actuality, in the present fact.
And to observe that actuality
Requires seeing without judgment, no evaluation, no opinion, no fear, just seeing what is.
The discussion on jealousy is also quite, well, stark.
It ties directly into this theme of dependence and fear, doesn't it?
It seems to.
Jealousy is presented as a form of fear born from clinging to others, a partner, children, maybe a belief system, because we are afraid to feel all alone, afraid of our own state of being.
And that fear manifests as jealousy.
As jealousy, possessiveness, potentially leading to hate and pain, yes.
And the source explicitly states jealousy is not love. Very direct.
Extremely direct. It's a huge challenge to how we often use the word love in relationships, isn't it?
Definitely.
We might call the mutual need for comfort or happiness love, but the source argues it's often simply using the other person as they are using you.
Yeah.
And it notes, looking at this uncomfortable fact is something we often resist. we don't want to see it.
This leads to a really radical view of love itself, particularly maybe in the context of relationships like marriage.
Yes.
Right.
The source states very clearly that where there is dependence, there is fear. And where there is attachment, there is no love.
And that's psychological dependence, not just physical closeness.
Right. Psychological dependence on ideas, people, property, status, all of it.
And it says you can't even think about love. How does that work?
That's another incredibly powerful statement. You can think about a person whom you love, the source says, but you cannot think about love. It claims love cannot be thought about. The moment you think about love, it is not love, it is merely mentation, just mental activity, just thought.
So thinking about love distances you from it.
That seems to be the implication. The mind, it argues, often tries to fill an empty heart with things of the mind, like ideas about love, memories, expectations. And this creates the very problems we face in relationships. For the mind to solve these problems, it must stop. Because only when the mind stops is there love.
So love isn't something you work at or practice, like being patient or kind.
The source is explicit on this. Love cannot be cultivated, love cannot be practiced. Efforts like practicing brotherhood, while perhaps well-intentioned, are still seen as activities within the realm of the mind, of thought, not love itself.
So when does love arise?
Love, it suggests, comes into being when all this is stopped. When the self-centered, dependent, thought-driven activity ceases. When the me gets out of the way, essentially.
And it connects knowing how to love one person to loving the whole. That's interesting.
Yes. Describing love as not quantitative but qualitative. The quality of love, when it is present, isn't limited. Knowing that quality with one person means knowing it in its fullness, potentially for all.
How does this challenging view relate to marriage, as it's often described in the sources?
Well, marriage is often portrayed as being based on mutual gratification and use, even when we wrap it up and call it love.
Use.
Yeah, using each other for comfort, security, pleasure. Safeguarding a partner is even compared to safeguarding property, rooted in the fear of being lonely, lost.
Ouch.
It's dark. The source argues that where there is usage, possession, and fear, love simply cannot exist. It suggests that marriage is based primarily on the biological urge or habit or the cultivation of pleasure. They tend to become deteriorating, leading to conflict and dissatisfaction. The call is for an intelligent handling of our relationships, understanding our everyday urges and existence deeply, not just relying on social norms or intellectual ideas.
The source makes a really striking statement. Love alone can transform insanity, confusion, and strife. That's putting a lot on love.
It is. And it adds that no system, no theory of the left or of the right can bring peace and happiness to man. It places the capacity for transformation squarely on the presence of love.
And defines that love how?
As having no possessiveness, no envy. There is mercy and compassion, not in theory, but actually in our immediate relationships with our family, our neighbors.
And this section concludes with that profoundly challenging phrase.
Right. There is love with its blessing when you cease to be, when the self dissolves.
That seems directly connected to the idea of living fully or passionately, which the source also discusses, beyond just physical passion.
Yes. The source describes passion as an inward core, a state of mind that is intensely alive, highly sensitive to everything, sensitive to suffering, to corruption, but also to the beauty of nature.
And it's presented as essential.
Very much so. Without passion, life becomes empty, shallow, and without much meaning. You can't truly feel or love, it argues, unless you are passionate. This passionate mind is always alert, learning, vital, engaged.
But being that sensitive and passionate sounds, well, vulnerable, maybe even dangerous in the world.
The source acknowledges exactly that. It says, a mind that is very passionate is always in danger.
Okay.
And perhaps it suggests this is why many of us avoid true passion. We opt instead for the safety of respectability, conformity, obedience, duty.
Things that keep us safe, maybe.
But things that are seen here as potentially smothering the act of learning, where learning means this vital, sensitive engagement with life, a kind of discipline without conformity.
The source also takes on the huge questions we all grapple with, like the purpose of life and, of course, death.
Right. And asking about the purpose of life, the source suggests, often arises from a deep sense of dissatisfaction, maybe emptiness, in our daily living.
So we look for something bigger.
Yeah. But perhaps, it posits, living itself, when fully understood and lived, is its own purpose and meaning. Seeking a grand purpose is often presented as an escape from facing and understanding our everyday anxieties, fears, ambitions.
So the suggestion is less about finding some preordained purpose out there and more about Something internal.
Yes, perhaps it's to free the mind itself from its own conditioning and then inquire. The Force even suggests that perhaps that very freedom itself is the purpose. Only in that state of freedom, it argues, can one truly discover truth, whatever that may be.
And what about death? Something most of us fear, isn't it?
Deeply. And the fear of death is linked directly to the desire for continuity. The desire to finish our projects, complete our careers, continue our pleasures, fulfill our sense of self.
Time. It always comes back to time.
Exactly. Death is seen as a frustration of this desire for self-fulfillment, which relies on time. The Source suggests that if you can live fully, fulfill yourself from moment to moment, then you are not afraid of death.
What continues after death, then, according to this view?
What continues is simply a wish, a desire. The self wanting to perpetuate itself through memory, through ideas. It offers a pretty radical perspective where, when there is love, there is no death. There is death only when the thought process arises, meaning when the self, which is built on thought and memory and time, is operating.
So love exists outside of time.
Love, described as merely being from moment to moment, is presented as being its own eternity. It's timeless.
That really challenges the whole idea of seeking immortality after death, doesn't it?
It does, completely. The Source contrasts seeking immortality after death with experiencing immortality only in life without death, which seems to refer to this state of being fully present, this timeless quality of love, where the self and its time-bound desires cease.
And belief in an afterlife gets in the way.
It argues that belief and hope in immortality must cease for this state to be, as they only strengthen the self that fears ending. The present moment in this view is the eternal. And the unknown truth, life, death, enters your heart only when the fear of death, linked to the self, ceases. It concludes, life is the unknown, as death is the unknown, as truth is the unknown. Death and life are one.
Wow. Okay. This intense focus on observation and attention brings us to the practice the Source discusses, meditation. But it sounds quite different from how many people think of meditation today.
Yes, it's defined very simply. Meditation in this context means to pay attention.
Pay attention.
That's the core. It's not about emptying the mind in a forced way, but investigation, constant watchfulness to see how the mind operates, observing the process.
And it's explicitly not about techniques or rituals, mantras, postures.
The Source is actually quite dismissive of practicing formulas, repeating mantras, specific postures, or breathing techniques as ends in themselves. These are seen as potentially silly, immature, maybe a form of escape, or even self-hypnosis that doesn't fundamentally change the conditioned mind.
So what is this true meditation then, according to the Source?
It's to be aware of the process of thinking, the Source says, to go into it carefully, step by step, with full consciousness, and discover for oneself the ways of the self.
So it is self-knowledge again.
Exactly. It's through this direct self-knowledge, gained through moment-to-moment observation, that the mind can potentially be free. Meditation is also described as attention to the whole movement of relationship in your daily life.
How you talk to people, how you react.
Yes, simply being aware of how you speak, act, and react to others without straining or forcing concentration.
Is that different from concentrating? Because often meditation involves concentration.
Yes, a very key distinction is made here. Concentration is seen as ugly, an exclusion, a forcing of the mind, a resistance to distraction. You're fighting things off.
Right.
Attention, on the other hand, is presented as allowing you to look at every thought, every movement, without pushing anything away. When there is this inclusive attention, the Source says, there is no such thing as distraction. Because everything that arises is simply part of the field of awareness. It's all data. And the Source stresses that a still mind is needed to perceive truth, and this stillness isn't achieved through force or technique, but arises naturally from understanding the structure and the nature of your life of every day. This deep, attentive understanding, it suggests, is what can bring about a total mutation in yourself, a fundamental change.
We've certainly taken a journey through some incredibly challenging but also, well, potentially transformative ideas from Krishnamurti's "What are you doing with your life?"
Right.
We've looked at his view that the world isn't separate from us, how our conditioned minds create conflict, the divisive nature of what he calls the self, and this potential for radical change through self-knowledge found in relationship in daily life.
The core message, it seems to me, running through it all, is this relentless call for direct observation of what is in your own life, your thoughts, feelings, reactions, but observing without judgment, without the desire to escape, and crucially, without trying to force change according to some external or internal ideal.
Yeah, this material really pushes back against relying on external systems, authorities, gurus, or even specific practices as the path to peace or transformation. Instead, it points entirely inward.
Right, suggesting that real freedom and understanding arise from watching the actual workings of your own mind and heart, moment by moment.
It suggests that dependence fuels fear, that ambition is often rooted in that fear.
And that the capacity for true love, for real intelligence, for insight, emerges only when the incessant activity of the self-centered mind begins to subside and attention becomes total.
It's a profound challenge, really, to be intensely aware in every moment, every interaction. A lifelong task, perhaps.
Yes, and maybe a useful reminder from the source. The true work of man is to discover truth, God. It is to love and not to be caught in his own self-enclosing activities.
So here's a final thought for you to sit with after this deep dive, drawn directly from the source. Krishnamurti suggests that only the man who seeks reality can create a new society. Only the man who loves can bring about a transformation in the world. What does that imply for you about the intimate connection between the state of your own inner world and the state of the world around you?